All right, so we're at 5:31. I think we'll get started. Welcome, CCBC members, to our Fireside Chat with Mayor John Tory. I know after we've all spent the last 3 months by our own firesides, we'd rather be out in a park with Mayor Tory, but at least we get a little bit of sunshine for today's program. I'm Sarah Kutulakos. I'm CCBC's Executive Director, for any of you who don't know me. First of all, just a housekeeping detail. In this webinar format, the participants, except for the panelists, are on mute, but we do want your questions. So we've disabled the chat function, and you can put any questions that you have for the Q&A into the Q&A box, and we will get to them later in the program. Please also be aware that we are recording this session. John Tory was elected mayor in 2014, and he has done such a fantastic job for the city ever since. And CCBC had the pleasure to support Mayor Tory's mission to China in 2016, and the City of Toronto has been a CCBC member for many, many years. Now, CCBC's mission, which is to ensure that Canada has more and better business between Canada and China, aligns very well with that of Toronto, which wants its local companies to be taking on the world and also is welcoming investment from around the world, including places like China. So, Mayor Tory, I'll turn it over to you for some opening remarks.
Sarah, thank you, and I'll be brief. First of all, thank you for having me on. I've done a whole bunch of these over time with the help of Emily, from my team, who's on with me as well tonight, and we found them immensely useful, going right back to the beginning of the pandemic, because it gave us a chance in the early going to get a keen sense very quickly of how devastating the whole thing was, and to get some advice from business and from other groups, labor, community groups, and so on, about what we could be doing to try and cushion the blow and to try and put ourselves in a position. And we're now very much in the mode, as you would know, of trying to fashion a recovery plan for the city that will take account of all the different aspects, including our relations with other countries and how we can open ourselves back up to continue to do business, because we're a trading city and a trading country, and we can't afford to be very long without those kinds of building blocks back in place as they were before. What we've been focused on as a city government is the things you'd expect. I mean, the first responsibility we had over the last number of weeks was the same as before, which is to continue to provide essential services to business and to people, because they need to have, roads and transit and police and fire and all those things that city governments are providing for people in a very basic, straight ahead way. The second thing we had to do is to protect health and save lives. I mean, this was and is a serious pandemic, and obviously took its toll in a tragic way in places like long-term care, but other places in the community as well. And had we not taken the steps we took, I was sitting in a room maybe 5 or 6 weeks ago on a Saturday morning, receiving a presentation that said the death toll in Toronto, just the city of Toronto, was likely to be 4,000 if we didn't take steps such as the ones we took in collaboration with the provincial government to basically shut the city down. And that came at a terrible cost, but I think everybody would agree without exception that that cost was one that you would pay, as opposed to having 4,000 people die of this terrible virus. The third thing we had to do is protect the healthcare system, because we knew that, frankly, if you'd been in a situation where 4,000 people died, it would be because the healthcare system had become overwhelmed, and you had to make the terrible choices people were making in Italy to put one person on a respirator as opposed to another, a ventilator. And we just didn't want to be in a position where we ever got to that point. So that involved as well trying to curtail the level of activity, and, as they said, repeatedly flatten out the curve so you didn't get a huge spike up in the cases of the virus that were presenting themselves in our hospitals. And then finally, something I expect we'll spend more of our time talking about today, we had to protect our way of life and protect the economy as best one could. And that meant protecting it in terms of the measures that have been undertaken, mainly by the other governments. And I've been an advocate on those things, but they've been very good partners. Mostly, I think that most of the money's come from the federal government. But I think they've worked reasonably well together, as we have with them, to make sure that these kinds of programs that help people, businesses, and now I'm pitching to make sure they help municipal governments, because municipal governments in the country, including led by Toronto, because Toronto is by far the biggest, have serious financial problems, not created through mismanagement by any means. Toronto, the day before this pandemic started, was probably the best managed country financially, in the best managed city in the country. We just did a debt issue just 10 days ago that was 2.5 times oversubscribed for the lowest interest rate ever, because people have confidence in the city and how it's managed. But all that was torn asunder when you had the pandemic start. People stopped coming to work, and as a result stopped riding the transit, which meant, for example, that we were losing between 20 and 25 million dollars, and we still are, per week, on lost transit revenue, and that adds up. You take that out 20 weeks and you've got hundreds of millions of dollars that we are short. So now we're on to the recovery phase, and I just came off one of these similar teleconferences with the Board of Trade and said to them that we need not only the expertise of people, including people who are expert in our relationships with other countries, such as this organization, but also businesses to tell us, how are we going to restart the restaurant sector and hospitality sector? We are people who hopefully can provide the kinds of supports and do the kinds of things to stay out of the way in many cases, but we're not experts in the restaurant business. We inspect them, we license them, we regulate them, but we don't run them. And a lot of people will say, thank God for that, they wouldn't eat at a restaurant run by the government. But having said that, we need to know what are the building blocks we need to put in place. What are the building blocks we need to put in place to restore, to the extent it has been diminished or in any way altered, the kinds of economic and business relationships where we have in place or had in place with China before this happened, because part of getting back to normal and back to a healthy state of affairs for the city is going to be obviously to restore our trading relationships, because we're a trading city and a trading country. So we're very much embarked on that process now. That's what we were talking to the Board of Trade about this afternoon, and that's what I hope we will talk about this afternoon. I'm very interested. I mean, I was honored to take a trip to China with your organization and with Sarah and a number of others, including Jan De Silva from the Board of Trade in 2016. I'm due to go there again next year. I am probably not the best informed person, certainly compared to the people that I'm on the phone with this afternoon, about how we're going to make sure that Canada-China relations are such that and I'm not overestimating my own importance, but there may be some who would suggest I shouldn't take those kinds of trips, given a lot of the issues that are kind of outstanding out there. And I have no particular perspective on that, because I can't spend much of my time on that when I'm dealing with the pandemic. But you may have some perspectives on that. I think a lot of the business has carried on through everything, through the issues that have nothing to do with the pandemic and through the pandemic issue. And I don't mean the pandemic issue in terms of where the origins of the virus were or were not. It's the layering on of other issues that existed before the pandemic that complicates life, in terms of saying, well, let's go back to just have a trip to China or just have normal relations like we had before. And I'm just being very candid, as is my want. I'd say the same thing if I was sitting in front of the Consul General. It's complicated. I don't know all the aspects of it, but I do know that we had significant relationships between Toronto and cities and regions in China, and that those are relationships that had been built up over a long period of time, as you well know in your organization. So I guess my last words, Sarah, would be to say this before we move to a question session. I hope that you are confident, as I am. And I try not to look at the world through rose-colored glasses. I hope you're confident, as I am, that the fundamentals of Toronto that made it such an attractive place for so many people from around the world to come and live and work and invest are still there, because they are. You'll have to convince people in some respects, because I think they've been shaken by what happened to them health-wise, what happened to them in terms of their jobs, what happened to their businesses. They've been shaken by that. This is an episode that's happened in our history like never before, never, ever in the lives of any of us. I mean, maybe you'd have to go back to the Second World War to find a similar period of complete dislocation for everybody, and thousands of people, in fact, losing their lives. But I'm very optimistic that those fundamentals are still there, and that if we can handle ourselves right, and right means doing the right things, but it also means doing them at the right pace to bring us out of the pandemic, that we will be stronger than ever. And that I've said to a number of people, and some of you may disagree with me or tell me ways in which we have to make what I'm going to say come true. I think today, if you had a person sitting in London, and sitting in, say, Germany, or pick a country, doesn't matter, sitting in China for that matter, and they were confronted by the opportunity of having a job in London, New York, or Toronto, I think the largest number of them would pick Toronto, because of our stability, because of the promise, because of the smart people we have here, because of the respect for diversity, because. And I think what we've got to do is get back to the point where that's the focus that's in the window, and immigration starts up again. I mean, we forget that we've lost sort of probably 2/4 of immigration to the city and to the country, which in Toronto's case probably means 20,000 people smart people, many of them from China, as we know, including international students, who would have been coming in here in the first 2 quarters of this year. And while that's not as important as trying to save lives from people who were here and who were at risk of dying and who did die, it's very important to the rebuilding of the economy that those 20,000 smart people end up here. And that we don't sort of just miss out on them permanently. So those are, again, things that I'd love to discuss with you. And while some of those things don't fit directly within the domain of the city government, you know that I can be and have been and will be an advocate for the city and for things that matter to the city, to the other governments. I was talking to the finance minister for Ontario this afternoon and talking to the deputy prime minister for Canada this afternoon in my role as the chief advocate for the city of Toronto. And I will continue to do that. And that includes representations that have to do with the businesses that you're all associated with, and trying to make sure those are as prosperous and active as possible, including our relationships with people that we do business with internationally. So I will stop there and look forward to answering your questions. And again, Sarah, to you and to all of the members who are taking part today, thank you for your time and thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Well, thank you very much. And yes, I know that the trip you made in 2016, where you were such an amazing cheerleader for Toronto, trips like that really do make a difference. And so I know it's been tough to do them over the last year, and this year is tough as well. But you know, I remember being part of your delegation on that trip, and you may recall we had some delegates that were really able to leverage the doors that get opened by a mayor being there in Toronto. And she'd go off and she'd have her meetings and she'd come back with business. And so you yield a bit of a magic wand when you do that. So
about that. I wish I had one.
We're hoping to get back to that. And I know a lot of our members are trying to get back to China. And in fact, over the last week, we've been working hard to try to get those who may have their homes in China and have been stuck here in Canada to get them their visas and their ways to get back in. And so that's something that we're trying to let members know is, you know, slowly but surely we're opening the cracks in the door on that. If we think back to that trip in 2016, one of your stops was Chongqing, and Toronto has been twinned with Chongqing for what, at least 30 years, I think. So what does Toronto do to keep connections with its sister cities like Chongqing, or even with newer interacting cities like Shenzhen, which I think have been more active in the last few years?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting when you ask that question, because I don't want to pawn this off on anybody else, because we should be doing it both ways. But Shenzhen, for example, has had a huge pickup in the kind of activity that's happening, including kind of mutual investments back and forth, especially in the innovation sector. And why has that been, in my view? It's been because it had a champion in Toronto on the city council, namely Denzel Menenwong. And it's been because it had a resident champion from Shenzhen that represented, I forget the name of the organization, but that they have here that is kind of it's not a friendship organization. It's more than that. It's meant to be, I think, purely business focused. And I think it's a lesson. And it's a lesson that for me too, because I think with Chongqing, where we have this relationship that's very long-standing, as you said. In fact, one of the reasons we went in 2016 was to mark the 30th anniversary. And I think the mayor was supposed to come here, maybe sometime this year, 2020, to celebrate our relationship. But have we, for example, done something, even if it's paid for by the private sector, which I believe the Shenzhen thing partly is, to establish an office there or to have them establish an office here? No, we haven't. Does that mean then that almost by definition you have a reduced level of activity? We did some smaller things when I was there, like we had some cooperation take place between one of the universities, as you might recall, and I think it was the U of T or York. But I really would like to have some encouragement from this organization to identify, what opportunity we're missing by not doing something much more explicit. Because I've said before, and I probably even said it on that trip, I am not in favor of us having a multiplicity of these relationships with cities, some of them being very historic, like this one. It's one of the longest standing ones, I would think, where we don't do something with that relationship. I mean, there's no point in it. I mean, it just disappoints everybody. And I remember from the reception we received that day, celebrating the 30th anniversary in Chongqing, they take it seriously. And I have to ask myself the question, do we do the same? And I mean, we in the broadest sense, we, the city government, the public service, we, Toronto Global, we, the business community and organizations like the Canada-China Business Council. If that is the relationship historically we have with one of the biggest cities in China, with the biggest city in Canada, then it is our responsibility to make something more of that. So it's a long way of saying we haven't done as much as we should. And I'd be very interested in hearing tonight if you thought there were specific steps based on your knowledge of Chongqing that we should be taking to build that relationship into more than it is today. And frankly, before I go back to China, I'd be embarrassed to go back there in 2021, which is the year I'd likely go, and go to Chongqing because it's our twin city, our sister city, and say, nice to be here again. Haven't done much since we were last here, what will then be 5 years ago.
Well, I think, since we last went, at least the province of Ontario has put somebody in the consulate in Chongqing. So there's that connection we could leverage. And we do try to host the Consul General of Canada from Chongqing when he visits. And so perhaps we could put that as an agenda item for his next visit, that when he's here, we work on, work on how we could work more closely with them and the city to do something there.
Yeah, and Sarah, you know how the private sector has to prod government. I mean, I think if you as an organization, as the Canada-China Business Council, were to come back to me and have a meeting, which we can do hopefully in person, after the pandemic, but if it's sooner, we can do it this way, to say to me, look, we think, because this is what we do, that on top of having the Consul General, which I would think would be a great idea, that we could focus on these two areas where we think there's an opportunity because we have members or relationships or something in Chongqing that's going to make that real. Because I'm very serious about what I said. I'm not a person who works well if I have to go back to a place, that I was in 5 years ago, probably saying great things about our relationship at that time, and they're going to think, well, this guy's not very credible because he comes back 5 years later and hasn't done anything. And so there's still time. It's not for that reason you do it, but there's still time for me to feel whole in going back to Chongqing, having done something that you could suggest is a priority because you know better than I do.
Well, and I remember on that trip, you offered the mayors of both Shanghai and Chongqing the chance to join you on that CN Towers Edge Walk, which you told us your kids had given you for your birthday. Have you ended up taking the plunge and doing that Edge Walk?
No, I've still got those 2 tickets, and I'd buy a third if all 3 mayors were here at the same time, and I would go, because the mayor of Shanghai was very interesting, actually, because some of the members that were on the trip will remember this, but the mayor, over there, these mayors of huge cities like Shanghai will maybe give you 20 minutes if you're lucky, even though you're from Toronto, which has a good relationship with China. And he gave us, I think, 45 or 50 minutes. And then at the end of it, I made this mention in a humorous way. And you never know whether your humor is going to go over when it's translated. And when I said, well, I've got this ticket, because he had actually been in Toronto before, for those who don't know. And he said that the CN Tower had inspired him to be very much a part of the big communications tower that exists in Shanghai, which prompted me to say, well, actually, I've got these tickets to go up on the Edge Walk, and I explained what it was. And I'll invite you if you want to come to Toronto to go on the Edge Walk with me. And so I let that pass. People chuckled. Some people understood and chuckled. And then at the very end of the meeting, which lasted, I think, maybe even a full hour, he turns back to me and he says, well, delighted to have had you here, and I'm going to come and go on the Edge Walk with you. So, it was odd that he remembered that and gave us so much time. So he probably, if he's still there, because I think it's one of the more powerful positions in China to be the mayor of Shanghai, obviously. And we'd be delighted to have him here on the Edge Walk. So if you want to act as my ambassador on that too, if that guy's not still mayor of Shanghai, he's somewhere powerful in the administration, because they tend to be the people who stay in those positions for a long time, as you know better than me.
Well, we will keep inviting. On that trip, one of the things we were talking to was companies that were looking at investing in Toronto. And we recently did a survey that looked at how business had been impacted over the last year, particularly with a lot of the bilateral tensions that are going on. And while we did hear some fairly sad news about the state of business, particularly for Canadian companies whose business had been down over the last year, we also pulled a decent number of Chinese companies in there. They were companies based in Canada, and a much smaller number of them said their business with Canada was down. In fact, for 35% of these Chinese companies, it was up, and for 50%, it was stable. And when we go to China and talk to investors, we make the case that once they're invested, foreign companies can operate as local companies, and this data tends to back that up. So if you think about some of the significant Chinese investors in Toronto, you think they would say the same thing?
I think so. I mean, being honest about this, I think there's been some sensitivity, whether that's correct or incorrect. Again, I'm not the best person to ask. There's been some sensitivity about the kind of the telecommunications areas. We all know there's been big debates about that in terms of these security issues that people talk about a lot. I think in other areas, if you looked at, for example, I well remember going to the announcement of Greenland buying a condo development that was partly underway on Adelaide Street. It's there and people are living in it now, I'm sure. But and it was a very significant event because Greenland had never made a big investment in real estate in Toronto before, even though they had an office here. I would say, and I stand to be corrected, and I'd be disappointed if I was wrong about this, that if you went to Greenland and said today, do you feel like you're treated like a local business here in Toronto, and that probably people, aside from the fact it might have Chinese, Canadian, or Chinese leadership, they just say it's a business, and we would sell them a piece of real estate or co-develop a project with them. I would say the answer to that would be yes. But again, I have to rely on people like yourselves. I mean, if you think that's not true and that people here are treated badly either for current political reasons, if I can call it that, or just because foreign companies generally are treated as if they're outcasts, I would want to know that. I've never had that feedback from anybody. I've had people say they faced hassles if they're trying to build a condo and they have a lengthy city approval process, but they don't ever say it's based on sort of where they're from. They just say that's an inefficient process. But I certainly want to hear, and that would be one of the things I'd want to hear about tonight. If people said, look, Chinese national-led companies or companies that are controlled by Chinese interests, meaning in shareholder control, are somehow not welcomed here or are treated differently than domestic companies, in any way that's meaningful, I would be surprised at that, but I'd certainly want to hear about it.
Yeah, well, I think our survey data backs up the fact that that is not happening. And in fact, I think Henry, who was with us from Greenland, is on the call today. So Greenland's still going strong, which is great to see. The one thing that some of our members have brought up is the sensitivity around potentially racist treatment of Chinese students, not just in Toronto, but on campuses overall. And I know there's been efforts by people like Mary Eng and others to really try to denounce that any sort of anti-Chinese or anti-Asian comments that are coming through, particularly as they might be related to COVID-19. So that's something we have our eyes on because we don't feel there's any.
Yes, and so I mean, I have the lash marks to show, and I'm not complaining about this. I'm actually proud of it. I mean, because people are now taking some comments I made early on before it was even a pandemic here, and at that time, people were confusing the origins, which may well have been in China. Again, I don't know that for a fact. I read about that, like we all do. But the origins of a virus in a given country or a given geographic area of the country, they were using that as a reason why they could be critical of and even abusive of, on places like the subway, Chinese Canadians. And I went at that time and said very forthrightly that that was completely unacceptable in our way of life here. And subsequent to that, I've had still to this day comments from people saying, well, if I hadn't been so busy worrying about that, then maybe we wouldn't have as many cases, or it would have been this or would have been that. I should have just called it the way I saw it, which is that this is some kind of almost one of those conspiracy stories that you read about on the part of our friends in China. I don't believe that. Nobody is really, did China handle this perfectly? I don't think so. Did we handle it perfectly? I don't think so. There'll be a lot of, post-pandemic examinations of those kinds of questions. But I certainly have tried, because I think it is so fundamental to our way of life going forward, to speak up against any instance of racism or discrimination. And there has been some of that has gone on against Chinese Canadians. And so I will continue to speak up on that, even though you get burned by some people for bothering to do it. But that's just part of our way of life, I think, as everybody on this call knows.
Yes, absolutely. And, related to how China experienced COVID-19, and, every country is treating it differently. But because this is a group of business people who are doing business with China, we all started getting hit by COVID-19 earlier than anyone else, and in many different ways. And as we now interact with our colleagues, my in Beijing and in Shanghai have been back in the office since probably middle of March. And we always laugh when we do conference calls at night and we can't get our guys to come because they're out at dinner or they're out golfing. They have haircuts. So we're very envious, actually, of their 2-month head start. And I think any of our colleagues that are in China now would tell you that now relative freedom and the ability to go to work and go to restaurants was extremely hard won, and came with a lot of sacrifice of really being locked down and making sure that that COVID-19 was being controlled. So I think as we try to get the economy back online, there's a lot that we can learn from what's happening and what has happened in China. And in fact, we have lined up in the next couple of weeks the first in a series of webinars about sort of practical tools for Canada-China business. And the first one will be getting things up and running, whether it be a shopping center or an office building or a restaurant.
Well, I hope when you do that, first of all, you'll invite two people. One would be our head of recovery, Saad Rafi, or his representative, to sort of just hear about that, because there are no ideas that are new, or if they're new in, Beijing or Shanghai or Hong Kong, they can be imported here. So I hope you'll do that. And I hope that I'll hear tonight, because if there are comments from your members tonight who want to say to me, look, John, the one thing for sure that you should do or not do in order to have a healthy recovery here. We've been keeping very close tabs. We have the good fortune, if you can call it that, of having suffered through this pandemic well after China, Taiwan, even Europe. And so we can watch bad things that happened in those places and try and prevent them. And we can watch good things they've done as they've tried to come out of the pandemic and copy those. There's no copyright on these good ideas to fight the pandemic. So I hope that even tonight you'll say, look, the one thing I haven't seen you doing as a city is this, and you should get on with it. And I also hope we can call on you as a resource, as I said at the beginning, to help us do the things we have to do to make sure people coming out of an experience with us, benefit from that in terms of staying healthy and their friends and family and co-workers.
Absolutely. And I do encourage people in the audience, throw your questions into the Q&A or comments about things that Mayor Tory has asked for commentary on. Now, on the side of encouraging companies to do more business with China, one of the things we found in our survey is that companies that are in sectors that are aligned with the 5-year plan or are doing things that are related to China's move to a consumption economy were much less impacted by the tensions over the last year. And I was noticing today that the city has an initiative called Shop Here, where Shopify is helping local retailers get up and selling online. And as you may know, Chinese consumers are the masters at buying things online, and they love to buy imported products. And in fact, one of our members that I think is on today's call, WPIC, has been helping North American retailers get up and running on Chinese e-commerce in a rapid fashion with like a 30-day program to take advantage of the demand that is back online there and can help to move product that has been just sitting in shut down retail in North America. And I'd love to explore how we could get more Canadian companies through that next hoop. Maybe they weren't online and Shop Here is getting them there. And then how can we move them even further?
So it occurs to me, in the Shop Here, just for the members that are on that don't know, we have two programs going on. One is called Digital Main Street, and we funded that, the city. And essentially what it did was went and set up a website for companies, small businesses that did not have any presence on the internet at all. And we did it basically for free. And we tripled the budget for that this year because it was proving to be very successful. We actually helped thousands of small businesses get online and have an online presence. And I'm sure the ones that bought into the program like a year ago really benefited from that this year, when the sort of front door retail side of their business was shut down. The second program, called Shop Here, is a different model, only in the sense that what we put together there was a number of companies who donated people, and it's principally about donating people. And we work with the Schulich School of Business at York University. And again, we create an online presence, but in this case, we're creating more than just a website. We're actually going to create an online store for free for a business. And we're using experts as well that come from those companies, so that we're actually not just taking their money, but we're taking some of their people to actually do the work of setting up the website. And again, we have a goal of 3,000 companies that will get helped by that program to establish an online store for themselves. And I venture to say that if you did that successfully for a lot of these businesses, depending what they're selling, you could have sales that in fact exceeded the sales that were in the old walk-in off the street business. But even if you just got back to even, that would be a huge accomplishment. So I think the expertise this organization could provide to us in that regard would be perhaps to help us go the next step. Once we get the online store in place, one assumes in English, maybe in English and French, because the two languages of our country. Could you help us with the outreach to the Chinese market in the context of the language, in the context of the customs, in the context of where the internet is the internet, but where do you go? What do you focus on? How does it work there in terms of e-commerce? Because, I think of that, I salivate as a person who used to be in business myself at the entire notion of a market of billions of people. We think we're lucky living next door to the United States with 350 million or whatever they have. This is a country with billions. So I think the more we can set up a digital presence, that's the easiest and cheapest way to do it. You buy something, you pay, and that's it. So I would love to sit with your people and discuss how we could take Digital Main Street and Shop Here and add an element to those that you call it like Shop Here International, because the Shop Here is meant to say, do some shopping online, benefiting Toronto and Canadian businesses that are struggling right now. But I think if you could expand that to Shop Here International and say, we're going to get access for you through your very same website to the Chinese market, people would think that was fantastic, as I would.
We'll put that on our list of things to work on together. One of the questions we've gotten from the audience is there any sense of how we as a society are going to be able to pay the cost of this pandemic?
To pay for the cost of it?
Yeah, and you alluded to the challenges of the municipal markets, for example.
And that's just government. I mean,
Yeah.
I think, I don't know. I think we're gonna have to give a lot of things a rethink. When it comes to government, I would argue that notwithstanding that our financial position has obviously deteriorated in the context of our balance sheet because we've taken on what amounts to a lot of debt to get through this period by all these programs that are helping business and people, that notwithstanding that, we're still in a relatively healthy state as a sovereign country relative to other countries in terms of our debt to GDP ratio. And so I think what we'll now have to work on is getting those government finances back in order. But if you go back and look at history, when these kinds of deficits have been rung up after a war, after a recession, they don't ever seem to really get back to a balanced budget, because a company doesn't run on a balanced budget either. It makes a profit, but you're not taking into account the money you've invested in, capital and the capitalization you've done of various expenses and so on, that gets you to a place that's different than if you just said it's all money, as we do. So I guess what I'm saying is that I think there is still a huge opportunity here to get the city back on its feet. I think that the financial situation will be addressed by the federal and provincial governments to at least look after our in-year revenue shortfall, so that we can be put back in a position where we can not have to slash and burn our budget because the money has been replaced by the other governments. I think it's going forward that I have to attend now to putting out the fire that is our finances. I think after that, though, what I've got to focus on is, what is it going to take to get some of the tech startups to stay here? What is it going to take to get some of them to come back when they effectively disappeared on the first day the city was locked down, or a week later? What is it going to take to keep the best and the brightest here in Toronto, as opposed to going to Silicon Valley, London, you name it? And I think these are longer term questions, again, on which I would appreciate your input, because I don't pretend to sit in my office and have magic answers to these very profound questions. But I think we're going to have to rethink our finances too, both private sector and public sector. There's good news in it too. I think the proof of our ability to telework from home means that, not good news for building owners and management, but I think that it means a lot of tenants who are in business will cut back on their office space. They will say, I don't need as much space as I thought I did, because I know now that half of my people are actually more productive when they work at home. Why wouldn't I want to continue that?
Yeah.
So I think there'll be big changes of many kinds like that that are going to come, that are going to change the financial parameters of business. I saw a story in the Star today saying, or in the Globe, that if you apply for this big company loan program, you're going to have to say that your CEO doesn't make more than $1 million. I mean, and it just sounds extraordinary that you have a program like that, but I think it's a program that actually in these times probably makes sense. So there'll be a lot of changes in stuff like that that's very small, and stuff at the top end that's very big.
Well, and related to working from home, one of the questions that came in is, what would be the impact on the city's revenue that's so reliant on real estate taxes, with these structural changes that may come from a different way of operating? And I think about our own office, and we probably don't need this much square footage. But at the same time, you've got tons of people that want to live downtown Toronto and maybe can't find the housing. Is there a possibility to have office space repurposed, for example?
Yes, we're going to be looking. It's very interesting you should ask that question, because one of the things that you have after a sort of pandemic bracket, deep economic dislocation like this, is you have the opportunity to buy some things that might not be for sale at the same price ever again, and never were before, not going back, 50 years. And so we're having a talk now about, instead of doing what we're doing with homeless people, and again, I welcome any of your comments, the people on the line here, instead of just taking the homeless people and putting them in hotels and paying just admittedly a discounted rate for a hotel room, we're saying to ourselves, well, should we build something on a vacant piece of city land? So we're now going to put in 2 installations of modular housing. And the great news about it is, you don't have to dig a foundation and have a big basement parking garage. You basically lay it down on kind of fairly simple foundation that itself is movable. And they're very nice units. Actually, they're about 750 square feet, but they're very nice. And I think people would feel very fortunate to have them. But that's instead of, we're going to buy the first 2 tranches as a pilot project, as did Vancouver, I believe. But we're doing that instead of, just pouring that money into other things. If we're going to focus on housing, then we got to focus on different ways to deliver housing. We might have put it into before building more TCHC housing units, or there's nothing wrong with that either, but it's just not the best way to do everything. So I think there's going to be a lot of different ways we do business, all of us. And I think we're going to have to, I think if we were smart, we'd be working on as many of those plans now, even if it's 3 or 4 months from now. And I think, when we get there, we've got to be ready to adopt a different way of life effectively. But I think people are up for that.
Well, and those hotels that you were using to house homeless, of course, are not being filled by travelers and tourists and people at conventions. And if I might paraphrase one of the questions we got, do you have any insight into when this global travel advisory, which would be avoiding non-essential travel, might be lifted by our government? I mean, we're seeing Europe lift their travel advisories much faster than we are.
I would just say soon, but by soon I don't mean tomorrow morning. I mean, it's going to be, a month, but in the time frame of the next month, you'll start to see those restrictions lifted. And I'm not sure it's going to start with trips from, I noted in the newspaper today, some of you may have read it, there are still 300,000 people a week arriving in Pearson. Now that's way down from what it would normally be. They're arriving from flights that are coming from all over the world. And they were expressing concern in this article, whether they were all clean of the virus when they got here. But I think they're being fairly strict at the airports now about self-isolation for the 14 days and so on. And I had a friend who was isolating, and he even told me the police came to knock on his door to check that he was there. And they basically won't let you out of the airport unless you have some plan that you've shown them as to where you're going, whether it's to your own residence or somewhere else. I think the international travel scene will be slow to come back because I think a lot of people will be nervous. I think a lot of people will, just think it's easier to not be doing that part of it at the moment, the kind of traveling part, and just stick closer to home and get some customers here. But I think what we should do for purposes of our, activities together is you should plan a trip for early 2021. I think that's going to fit in with a lot of other people that are going at that time, but we can go with the, with the business council and with the board of trade and with some university reps and some business reps and have a really good trip, and the rules I'm sure will be changed by then.
We will mark it on the agenda. Now, a couple of questions have come in on something that I also wanted to ask. So, when we did that trip in 2016, you had Invest Toronto, which was just focused on the municipality. And since then, Invest Toronto has merged, I believe, into Toronto Global, which is more of a regional focus. So how do you assess that more integrated approach, and has the city benefited? And then on that same topic, what are the areas of investment attraction that you're really looking for from countries like China?
Well, I am biased about Toronto Global because I was the sort of originator through my role as chair of Civic Action in 2012, I think, of the idea of having a regional organization. And I then fought for it as a private citizen, and basically did a lot of the work together with Toby Lennox, who was the CEO, and others, to bring the other municipalities on board. Toronto was there. We were sort of seen to be the originators of the idea. We were prepared to put in, which we did, the most money. But if it was going to work, obviously, to be regional, it had to have Mississauga and Brampton and, Markham and so on in there, and they all joined. How is it working? I think it did a great job putting our pitch book together for the Amazon bid, which proved that we had a great story to tell and that we could put in a bid that made it all the way to the finals out of hundreds of cities without one penny of government money in there to incent these people to come. Mm-hmm. I think that it has done a great job because I've gone to the opening of quite a few new businesses in Toronto. And when I go to the opening, and the people inevitably, if it's a Toronto Global account, speak to me and say, those people did a great job, because they just have that knack, because they've all worked, like all of them, I think pretty well exception, have worked in hospitality before. And so they know the ropes, they know what you offer, what you don't offer. And we've had a surprising number of concluded investments in Toronto that came from almost a cold call, the kind you were talking about your daughter making. So I'm very bullish on Toronto Global. I think we're going to have to do some refinement, just because everything will be refined this spring because of the pressures of refrigeration and all kinds of things like that. But I think that we can really make Toronto Global hum, because I think the the municipalities around Toronto are starting to buy in that it's one for all and all for one, that it's more efficient than everybody taking their own trip to China and everybody opening up offices over there. That's a sort of a waste of money, and it's too much attention for a country like ours that's relatively small.
Yeah. And then what about sectors? What are the sectors that you think Toronto
Well,
highlight the most?
I tend to think that what we have to do is, and I know the Chinese would consider themselves, and rightly so, very innovative, but I tend to think we've got a level of innovation going here in AI and technology, food processing, health tech, clean tech. And so I think, depending on which way we're looking at the investments coming and going, I think those are areas in which we can seek out investment and capital to help these companies to grow. When I became mayor, I remember them saying to me there was just no money you could access up here in Canada. And one of the reasons the tech and other sectors, green tech, clean tech, couldn't grow was they didn't have access to that kind of second stage capital they needed. I think that problem has gone away. I think that people saw the cluster of smart people that were here in Toronto, and they came here with their money to invest. And then they found some home runs that were hit, not so much us having a chat on a webinar, but somebody who had started a business online and was on every single night selling something or doing something. And I think that has really helped us a lot. But I would say that, we have undersold ourselves on clean tech. We've undersold ourselves on health tech. And we've undersold ourselves on tech generally. And I think, look, I'll be honest again, I think the political goings on have complicated that, just because we can't go and make as clean of a sales pitch, and some people were even afraid to go and do that because they didn't know what might happen to them. I tend to think those fears were overstated, but I understand them, because I think what has happened over there is certainly contrary to the normally accepted way of life that we have.
Yeah, no, and that's we definitely did see some of our members hesitate to travel for those very reasons. On clean tech and health tech, there's been some very interesting stories, like the Blue Dot story of the company that had been able to track this coronavirus just as it was coming into play. And so I think companies like that have a lot of potential to collaborate with China and with other markets. So that's certainly an area we see a lot of potential in. Let's see, we've got a couple questions here. I encourage you guys to give us more. One of the things that has appeared in the news recently was the recent exit of Sidewalk Labs, which I think can be seen as both a loss to Toronto, but also an opportunity for new thinking along the waterfront. So how do you see that situation, and generally the thoughts about smart cities?
Well, first of all, on Sidewalk, I mean, it's one of those questions people are too polite, including you, to ask, is sort of what happened there, because sometimes people, they teach you in law school, never ask a question to which you don't know the answer. And what happened there, I would put it very simply, because I was sort of on the periphery, a very important role in the periphery of the discussions, because we're one of the owners of the Waterfront Corporation. We just couldn't make a deal. In the end, they were picked from those who wanted to make a deal, but the deal wasn't done by the picking. The deal was the selection process that selected Google from among those who put in to develop that piece of land, said, okay, that's the person we're going to sit down and negotiate a deal with. And like many of you have experienced, we just couldn't get the deal done in the end. There were just issues that stood in the way, and a pandemic happened. So it's unfortunate. I was quite excited about the prospect of Google, Sidewalk, Alphabet, being in business in a bigger way. Google will stay in business in Toronto, as will Sidewalk, actually, and they have hundreds of jobs in the corridor between here and Waterloo, and they're keeping an office in Toronto because they so much like doing business here, which I think is a good part of the story, if there is one. Now what's going to happen? I think we have to rethink it. I think we have to do much better on process, where I think one of the reasons that deal didn't end up getting made is it had such a bad start, because people were rushing the announcement out the door before proper governance had been followed. And I don't mean to say anything improper happened, but it was just the kind of consultation and discussion that saves you some agony later. And I'm a great believer in that. And so I think now what we have is if you said, what did we start with? We started with one of the most valuable pieces of waterfront land in North America. What did we end with? We ended with one of the most valuable pieces of land on the waterfront in North America, minus some time, obviously, minus a little bit of money, not actually all that much, because more of the money was put up by Sidewalk Google, and I don't say that with any joy. And so I think we start over again and say, okay, what do we want that piece of land to be? Do we want to go back to this notion of an innovative city of the future, sustainable, et cetera, or do we want to do something else? And I think we've got to sort of discuss that first and not take a long time to do it, and then have another competition to say, okay, this is the same vision we had or a modified one. Now let's hear the ideas that you have, people from all over the world, as to what we can do with this piece of land. And I think there'll be no misunderstanding the second time that the piece of land is what it's about, not some whole site of the Portlands or whatever, and that you've got to do it in collaboration with us in government, not in a way that becomes in some way adversarial.
Well, and one of the issues that appeared in the press quite a bit was just the issues around people's personal data and privacy. And I think that, some of the controversy around that, it aligns with some of what we've seen around how countries are fighting COVID-19. And, you have not just China, but other Asian countries that have done a lot around digital contact tracing and people's willingness to be known where they were and what they did, such that the disease can be perhaps combated more quickly, versus a bit of a more North American approach to, the right to not, to not be known, so to speak.
But you know what the good news is, Sarah, on the data piece vis-a-vis Sidewalk, is that the Sidewalk issue that was raised about them, meaning Sidewalk, Google, having control of data coming out of Toronto, forced a discussion that forced us to put in place a digital framework that sort of talked about how our data would be managed. It would be held in the ownership of the public sector, meaning the city. It would be managed so that anybody who needed to use it, including if it had been Sidewalk, was using it under constraints, so that they weren't just saying we can do whatever we want with this data. So the good news is, as we embark on a revisiting of the quayside piece of real estate that Sidewalk was going to develop, is we have that very important building block in place. And frankly, we've learned the lessons of not having answers to those questions before we started. So I think that was the kind of thing, when we hurried a bit, that bogged us down. We tried to hurry to get it done. And meanwhile, the people out there were serving notice there was a privacy issue. I'm not sure it was taken as seriously as it should have been. And then it does damage on the way through that, you can't even calculate.
Yeah, that makes sense. So one of our audience members has asked, what do you think is Toronto's comparative advantage in doing business with China relative to other Canadian cities such as Vancouver?
I think it's scale. I think that if you even look at Vancouver and Toronto, and I say this with no disrespect to Vancouver whatsoever, I love Vancouver, but it's scale. If you look at the scale of everything we have here, the scale of our financial sector, top 10 in the world. Vancouver wouldn't even be on the list of the top 30, I wouldn't think. Scale when it comes to tech, third largest tech hub in North America behind Silicon Valley and New York. Scale when it comes to film, the arts and culture. Again, Vancouver is a wonderful city for the arts and culture, but Toronto, just by definition, has a sector there, including the film production sector, the film festival, that whole world that's extraordinary and dwarfs the size of most other such sectors in the country. So I think it's scale. And because if you said, okay, let's go through some of the things we normally talk about, taxes. Well, the taxes, I think, are going to be about the same because it's Canada. Quality of life, about the same. You might even give a small edge to Vancouver on that, but let's say it's about the same. If you then looked at, you then get to considerations like size and scale. And costs are going to be probably about the same between the two cities. Maybe, in fact, Vancouver, for reasons that I don't fully understand ever, has even more expensive costs, probably because it starts smaller, and as you get a crush with no vacancy, it means you push rates even higher for rental and stuff. So I think if you look down all the things you'd normally look at, how many smart people, the diversity, the taxes, the costs, the supply of office space. Toronto and Vancouver, for example, are going to come out probably vis-a-vis Shanghai in the same position relative to each other. Now the challenge is, I think, for us to take a mayor in a city like was it which city was it you mentioned? Prince George or anyway, you mentioned it. Vancouver. Well, it's okay, Vancouver, and put them in a position where they can where they can take advantage of what they're doing. But in our case, it's going to be about scale, because they can never say they're a city of 3 million in a region of 7 million, with the third biggest financial center, tech center in North America, the biggest financial center in Canada, top 10 in the world. They can't say those things, and we can. And that means a lot, I think, to businesses. I would believe, I don't know how active Greenland is in Vancouver, but I would believe one of the reasons they're certainly here is because of the scale of the city relative to Edmonton, or no offense to Edmonton at all. I hope the Chinese invest a lot in Edmonton and do lots of business there.
Okay, now Chinese, sorry, one of the questions we have is Toronto's universities and colleges rely heavily on international students for their revenue base, and COVID-19 makes that tricky. You've got some students that have stayed here while campuses shut down, and others who may find it hard to get back from overseas. Does the city plan to offer any support to these academic institutions and/or international students?
We're really not in a position. I have to give this answer every time I'm asked what the city's going to do to help tenants or commercial tenants or institutions that take in foreign students or even the graduate students themselves. Our government is set up, and all city governments in Canada are set up on the basis that they have all of their financing comes basically from property and commercial taxes, and that they were never meant to pay for social programs or for education or for a whole host of things. They were meant to pay basically for kind of hard services, for sure, the stuff I talked about earlier on at the beginning, the police, the fire, the roads, the transit. And they were meant to pay for softer services, to which we're best at delivering because we're closest to the people. So that's where you bring in childcare and the different programs that are helping people that are marginalized, of which we do a lot. So I think that we have an opportunity there again, and I think that we are going to have to sort of build on that and make our own luck happen. I just don't think we're going to sort of luck into a situation where all of a sudden we just have the good times rolling here again, including with China, because we sat back and waited for it to happen. I think we're going to have to decide on a strategy to pursue it. I think you have to fit that strategy within the context of the relationship between Canada and China, which is different than it was 5 years ago. But nonetheless, I think you have to figure out how you can continue to do some business with those cities and with that country, because it's one of our very biggest trading partners. You can't just sort of write off a relationship like that and say, well, too bad. I guess you could, but I don't think there's too many people that want us to do that.
Well, and related to that, a question just came in from an audience member that says, notwithstanding what you said about going back to Chongqing and having done so little so far, would you be willing to go back as a role model for engaging with China in juxtaposition with a number of other Canadian politicians?
It's very interesting because I've even discussed that. Like, I'm painfully honest about these things because there is no other way. I mean, when it came to the flag raising last year, I'll give you an example even before that. Just at the beginning of some of the difficulties involving some Canadians who I do believe are wrongfully detained, and that's a very serious matter, the Consul General invited me to come to his residence for dinner. And I had met the Consul General quite a few times. He's still relatively new. He's been here, maybe 2 years. And I went to the dinner. And at the dinner, we had a very pleasant time talking about culture and about business and the things that, the Business Council would talk about. And then at the end of dinner, I did what I had promised myself I would do, which is I raised the issue of both the detainees and how they were being treated based on what we knew. And I raised the issue of the canola, banning of Canadian canola based on alleged bad quality. And I said to them, people in Canada would understand the irony of the mayor of Toronto, the ultimate urban resident, the mayor of Canada's biggest city, raising the matter of canola farmers and their well-being in a meeting with the Chinese Consul General. But I said, look, this is an important part of our relationship with your country. And we believe that the grounds upon which Canadian canola was being denied access to the Chinese market were fabricated. And I raised that point with him. And he respected that. He took it on board. His political counselor sitting across the table started to sort of slowly slide down in his chair. It looked like he was going to disappear under the table at any moment. But similarly, when it came time for the flag raising, I just said, well, look, I wasn't going to make a fuss about it. Had it not been for the press calling and asking me why I wasn't going, I would never have said anything about it. I just would have not showed up for the flag raising on the national day. Yeah. So I do think it is important that I think you can maintain relationships, and I would always be guided by what the government of Canada wanted to do in the context of their having responsibility for that relationship. But we have relationships with these cities of long standing. We have trade and commercial relationships. And if the government of Canada didn't forbid it to be done, I would go back to China. And I'm saying that with a big asterisk, hoping that by the time I would go back, because I already had some trips planned for 2020 to other countries, if I go back in 2021 as planned, that it is with a substantial improvement that has taken place in the meantime on some of those matters that are sources of profound concern and profound aggravation. And so I would just say, though, would I show leadership in doing that? yes, I would. But I think we couldn't go under the present circumstance and just say, well, we're just going to forget all that and go over there. I think we'd have to see some gestures of good faith on all sides, and a gesture of sending the mayor of the biggest city with some business and political people over there, I think would be a good gesture, but it has to be accompanied by one coming the other way on some things we care deeply about.
Well, and those are things that definitely the business community also cares deeply about. We heard about them in spades in our recent survey. So I think we have time for one more question. And you've touched on this a bit, but this participant says, the city of Toronto has several relationships in China. How, in your opinion, should Toronto be pitching its story in China? And how are you promoting the strengths of your relationship cities in Toronto?
I don't think we're doing enough of it. And I was very honest about that at the beginning, and it may be a very good note on which to end this encounter, and maybe in the hopes that we could have another one, because what I really am very sincerely asking you to do, like, I think here's what happens. I think we have Toronto Global, who I think, to be frank, based on where they send me, have priorities that are in places like Europe, South America, and so on. I think maybe because of what's gone on with the relationship, and because of the fact that the Chinese building the relationship between China and Canada can be painstaking and frustrating, as you well know better than I do. And I think as a result, some of the emphasis has been taken off. I think what I would rely on you to do, which I think would help to both give us a focus for those relationships and provide the basis upon which we might make a trip in a year or so, if all things being equal, is to say to me, okay, when it comes to Chongqing, we know as much or more about Chongqing than the mayor does, because you do. We probably know as much as the Economic Development Department of the City of Toronto, even though they've been managing that relationship for 32 years now. Here are the areas in which we think you should focus. Here's the academic area you should focus in terms of some kind of exchange or student program. I've commented before, including at a dinner I was at with Mr. Mulrooney, the former ambassador to China, that, you know, we have all these Chinese students come here, and yet we make no real effort to send any Canadian students there of any substance, and we should. It would be good for those young people to make up those, to learn and to make up the networks over there that are going to serve them well, whatever they do for the rest of their lives. And so I think if you said, okay, that's the academic focus, this is the business focus, and this is the cultural focus, even if you just took those, the big three, said business, academic, cultural, these are three things we're going to probe in Chongqing and the relationship between Chongqing and Toronto in the next 24 months. I would be thrilled at that initiative. And if you wanted to pick, pardon me, two more cities that you think are the, you know, Shenzhen, we mentioned earlier, we have a bit of a relationship that's burgeoning here, thanks to the fact they've opened an office here. And so if you said that we should do something there, fine. And then maybe the third would be Shanghai, because I did say to the mayor when I was there and his officials, you know, and this is no offense to Chongqing, but had we not had a pre-established relationship, I think the logical city that you would have picked for Toronto to have a relationship with if you were starting from scratch would be Shanghai. Right. And they said to me at that time, interestingly, well, there's no reason we can't have a relationship that isn't a twin city or whatever one wants to call it, but it's just a relationship to say, again, we're going to pick three areas, whether it be political, academic, business, or cultural, where we're going to do some cooperating together and just do some things together. Whether it amounts to a precise measure in dollars and cents is a different question. It may be that sometimes it's just that you establish that relationship and you have people going back and forth, you know, putting on concerts, but that creates more meaning to the relationship than if you were selling widgets back and forth where you never even see each other.
Yeah, no,
so
that makes a lot of sense.
I'll make that as a request of you. I know that you know, people ask things of government all the time, and that's what we're here for. But I would make a request of you if you felt that you could supply me with some ammunition in that regard to say, okay, these are the three areas, starting with Chongqing, because we have that relationship that we should focus on. Say under the headings you choose, but academic, cultural, business. I will take that to heart. I promise you, and we'll sit down and meet and discuss it and try to activate it.
Sounds good. Well, our Ontario chapter will be happy to take that on in conjunction with our China that knows these cities well. So that's bringing us to the end of our time. So Mayor Tory, we'd like to thank you for spending this time with us. It's not something we get to do with you very often, and we would be pleased to do it more and more often.
Me too.
And, you know, when you think about where those opportunities lie and that digging in, one of the things we're really going to be spending a lot of time on over the next year is China's 5-year plan, which is coming to an end this year, and the new 5-year plan is being put in place. And sectors that are very well aligned with that plan are the ones that do well. And so we'll try to bring that into our analysis for you. And
thank you.
those in the audience can look to see more from us. You know, there are the Liang Hui, the 2 meetings that are happening at the end of this week, which is the final milestone, we think, in China's recovery, that they're bringing thousands of people together in Beijing for these meetings, and that helps to set the direction. And so there's going to be a lot of tea leaf reading over the coming months, and we'll make sure to try to bring that to people. So thanks to everyone for coming, to our Ontario chapter for setting this up, and to you, Mayor Tory, for being with us. Stay well.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks to the council, and we'll look forward to chatting with you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you much.
Bye-bye. Bye.